you should relate with this question. Because some of you are foreigners in this country here, and some of you lived in other countries as a Korean. And so I think almost everyone in this room has been a foreigner at some point in their lives. So go ahead and tell me, what's hard about being a foreigner? Yes, Tommy?
Be on display all the time.
On display. So Tommy's on display. Everyone turns their head when they see that blonde hair.
At least you cannot easily, let's say, not attend a class if you're one blondie in the team.
So you can't skip classes because everyone knows when you're not there. Okay. So you're a source of attention, right? What else? What else is difficult about being a foreigner?
Language barrier.
Language barriers, right? So you're living in a country where you're not a native speaker of that language. Some of you might not even have any language skills in that language. It's difficult, right? Especially because some nations are more accommodating to foreigners than others. Korea's gotten better. It's gotten better. You know, like when I first got here, it was pretty bad. It's gotten better. You know, I can say for sure, subways are pretty easy, right? But to master the bus, you gotta learn Korean. There's no way around it. All right, what else? What else is difficult about being a foreigner?
Cultural differences. Cultural differences.
Cultural differences, right? So, you know, there's just differences in culture that can be very big, right? Like especially, you know, as an American living in Korea, there's a big difference between the West and the East, right? I know, like, number one, things like personal space are very different than, like, people don't understand what personal space is here. Space is space. It's meant to be filled. Okay, so there's a lot of different things. There's a lot of difficulties in being a foreigner, and in this chapter, Ruth is a foreigner, right? She has now traveled with Naomi back into the land of Israel, which is not her country. And so now she's living the life of a foreigner. So I want you to just keep that in the back of your minds as we get into the passage today. So Ruth chapter 2, starting with verse 1. Open your Bibles, smartphones, or look at the screen. Ruth chapter 2, starting with verse 1. Where the Lord says this. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead," she added. "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "Even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Amen. Long passage, long story, and this is kind of where things are kind of taking a turn. If you remember, last week, we saw that, Naomi had gone through such horrible things, right? She lost her husband, she lost her 2 sons. All she had left were these daughter-in-laws, and she told them to go away. And this one daughter-in-law, Ruth, refused to let go of her. And so she returns back from the land of Moab back to Israel with nothing except for this daughter-in-law, and all she can tell everybody is, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara," meaning don't call me pleasant, call me bitter. That was the heart of Naomi. And what I pointed out to about last week was she was blind to what God was giving her in this wonderful daughter-in-law, Ruth. God was wanting to give her hesed. God was wanting to show her his unfailing love, but she was blind to it. But now we're seeing things have changed very significantly in chapter 2. So immediately, the first verse tells us that there's this relative of theirs, this man named Boaz, a man of standing, which kind of implies that this guy can help them. These are 2 women that have come back from another land. They've been outside of Bethlehem for a long time, and they have no means of taking care of themselves, right? This is a very dire situation. There are 2 women, they don't have any food, they don't have any money, they're just there. What's going to happen to them? And when you look at this, it really seems like Naomi does not care, right? She just like, so actually, help me out here. So basically, Ruth is like, "Hey, we gotta do something. We're gonna die. I'm gonna go get us some food." Okay, so she comes up with this plan, talking about how she's gonna go to these fields and try to find someone who shows her favor. Right? She's a foreigner. She knows that automatically she's gonna be treated harshly. And Naomi replies. Now, in the translation that I read, like the NIV, it says, "Go ahead, my daughter," which sounds very cordial, right? If you actually look at the original language, she only says 2 words. It's literally just "go, daughter," right? She basically doesn't care. She's not like, "Hey, be careful out there, my daughter," or like, "Hey, there's this guy Boaz that we're related to." She doesn't tell her anything. She just says, "Go, daughter." Right? She basically gives the shortest, courteous reply that she possibly can, and really seems to care less about what's going to happen to Ruth. Just to give you an idea of what she's planning to do now, gleaning. Gleaning is simply when you go to a farm and there's people harvesting, right? There's people harvesting all the grain that they have. There were laws in the Old Testament that allowed poor people to actually survive off of the farms of others. Number 1, the farmers were not supposed to harvest from the 4 corners. So the very corners of the field, they were supposed to leave untouched so that the poor, the widows, the orphans could actually come and take from there. So that's number 1. They had the 4 corners that were left untouched. The other thing is that as they were harvesting, they would sometimes drop like a piece of grain here and there. What the Bible told them to do, what the Old Testament told them to do, was leave it on the ground. And that was for the poor people to come and pick it up. So there was a system in place in the Old Testament that allowed for poor people to survive off of the bounty, the plenty of others. And so Ruth's plan was to glean. She was going to go to these fields. She was basically going to stay behind the workers, and whenever they dropped something, she would go pick it up. the best job in the world. And honestly, if you were to do this, you probably wouldn't get that much. Especially because these are professional farmers, right? It's not like, like these guys know what they're doing. So it's not very often that they will make a mistake. So generally, you would just come back with like a handful of food. But that was their plan. And so that's what Ruth did all day. Right? By the time that Boaz gets there, she'd been there for the entire day. Now, what this tells us is that there's a system in place. Now, this is just one of them. The gleaning laws is one. In another, I'll talk about later, there's ways for your relatives to help you. I'll tell you about that in a little bit. And there's also other concepts in the Old Testament, things like the year of Jubilee, the seventh year, the Sabbath year. There are a lot of different rules that allowed for the poor to be restored or to be taken care of. And what God teaches in the Old Testament is that He desired His people to be generous with what they had. And what it says in Deuteronomy 24, which is related to what I just talked about with gleaning, is that if you take care of others, right, if you bless those that are around you, God will bless all the work that you do. And so it's one of the points I want us to just kind of sit on for a second is to understand that generosity is something that God desires of His people. Boaz was a man of plenty, but even Boaz was trained to give back to those that were in need. And so I think many times we have to be reminded of that God desires His people to be generous, and as we are generous unto others, God blesses them. I've told this story before. I'll just tell it really quickly. So there's one time I used to be known as the guy to come to when you were going on a mission trip. So everyone would come to me, they would ask for money for their summer mission trip. I went to a church with a lot of college students, and so every single person that had a mission trip would give me, one of those support letters, right? And one summer I gave out too much money, and I guess I was a little bit too generous. And I started to do the math, and I'm like, uh-oh, I'm in trouble, come near the end of the year. I was like, what am I gonna do? So I was supposed to go on a business trip all around Asia. So I went to China, Korea, and Japan. So I was gone for about a month. And I was like, okay, this is good. My company's going to pay for my food, so I'll save a little bit of money. So I'm going on this business trip. I'm gone for a month. But then as I'm getting ready to come back, I'm like, oh man, I gave out too much money. I'm still in trouble. I get back and the first thing someone asked me is like, hey, you know it hailed while you were gone, right? And I was like, well, what are you talking about? So in Texas, I lived in Texas, God sends down hail, right? Hail's in the Bible. It's like these, these pieces of ice that come from the air, right? Some of you have never experienced this, but sometimes these pieces of ice can be about the size of a golf ball, right? So when it's coming from the sky, it does damage, okay? And so people are like, yeah, it hailed in your neighborhood. And I'm like, really? And so I looked at my car, and at first I didn't notice it, but then when I looked at it at a certain angle, I was like, oh, there's little holes everywhere, little dents. And so I said, what do I do? They're like, well, go to your insurance company. I was like, okay. So I took my car to the insurance. There's an office, and they were checking out the car, and I was like, oh man, what's going to happen? And so they looked at it, they're like, okay. And they wrote me a check for $2,000. And I'm like, what is this? They're like, well, this is for you to get this fixed if you want. I'm like, I don't have to do this? So you can do whatever you want. I was like, what about my insurance premium? Is it going to go up? They're like, no, this is an act of God. And I was like, hallelujah. And so that, that to me is when you're generous, God takes care of you. That's my simple story about that. But for me, God held on my car while I was gone. But regardless, God blesses those who are generous. And here Boaz is a man of great generosity. Now, what's also very clear is that Ruth had no idea who Boaz was or where his field was. And it says, by chance, she ends up in the fields of Boaz. Very clearly, just like in the story of Esther, God made this happen. This is a divine orchestration. God knew what she was going to do, and God sent her to the one place that she needed to be at, the field of Boaz. Now, Boaz shows immediate favor. Actually, the line that he says, what was it? It's who does this woman belong to, or something like that? If you actually look at the literal translation, it's something like, whose woman is that? Like, that's literally, he sees her, he's like, whose woman is that? That's what he says. Like, it cracks me up. But anyway, he sees her immediately. He knows who she is, and all of a sudden he's showing favor upon favor, right? You know, it said in the Bible that she carried back an ephah of grain, right? An ephah is about 30 pounds or about 13 kilograms. That's a pretty large amount of food. Like, you know, like to carry, like, it's not like she lived nearby. She had to walk a long distance. So Ruth had to be of pretty good girth to carry back, you know, 30 pounds or 13 kilograms of food, right? And actually, they estimate that value of what she took back home was about half a month's salary. So that's very significant. She was given not just, you know, a good amount, she was given a ridiculous amount by Boaz. And so Boaz does all these things. He's like, my men will not take a hand on you. Stay with my women. You'll be protected. Have water whenever you want. There were rules about gleaning, but there were no rules saying that you had to show that much favor to anybody. If anything, you just left them alone. You didn't care about the gleaners. But he saw this woman who calls herself a foreigner, right? A Wegugin, right? Calls herself a foreigner, and he shows her all this favor. And my question when I read this was, why? Like, why is Boaz so awesome? And you know, and the passage itself focuses on Ruth, and he talks about how she's left her people, she's left her family, she's left her land to a place that she's never been to, all for this woman Naomi, right? And it makes it seem like it's all about Ruth. But as I got into this passage, I started to think more about, who is this man Boaz? And so if you look at who Boaz is, the passage tells us a couple things. It tells us that he is a close relative to Elimelech, Naomi's husband. It also talks about he's a man of standing and wealth. Obviously, he has many fields. We see very clearly that he's a very generous man. At the end of the passage, we find out that he's the son of Salmon, or at the end of the book. And actually, if you look in the genealogies, especially in the book of Matthew, it talks about how he's not only the son of Salmon, but he's the son of Rahab as well. I'll talk about Rahab in a second, but you guys should remember that Rahab was a foreigner, and she's also known as Rahab the prostitute. Let me go back to that in a second. Now, the other thing is, if you look at chapter 3, by some of the things Boaz says, you can kind of guess he was a little bit on the older side. He wasn't a young man. And this actually is, if you think about, if he was the son of Rahab, that's probably true. Rahab was back in the early part of Joshua's conquest. Judges, which is when this is happening, is much later. So Boaz should be a relatively old man, not like a grandpa, right? This is kind of gross, he's grandpa. But he's an older man. And one of the things I like about Boaz, when you look at this book of Ruth, not just this chapter, but the following chapters, he is a man of action. He is constantly doing something. Only time he's not doing something, he's sleeping in the beginning of chapter 3, right? But you know, that sleeping is an action. So he's doing something all the time, right? He's probably sleeping actively. But anyway, he's a man of action. You see in this passage, he shows up and he's just throwing out blessings. He's like, you know, the Lord be with you. He's just doing all these things. I like Boaz. Now let's talk a little bit about more of who he really is. Now Rahab the prostitute. Rahab, this is his mother. Rahab the prostitute. This comes from Joshua chapter 2. When they're scouting the promised land and they're looking at the cities and they go to Jericho, Rahab is a prostitute in Jericho. And these two spies end up in her house and she hides them from the authorities. The king of Jericho sends troops to her saying, hey, we think people came here. And she's like, yeah, they left already. They went that way, right? And she shoos them away and she protects these men. And then she explains why. Because she says in chapter 2, verse 11, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. She has heard about all the things that has happened to these people from Israel. She has heard about how they left Egypt and how, water was parted for them. She has heard all these things, and she believes that the God that they worship is the one true God. And all she asks in return in verse 12 is, "Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family because I have shown kindness to you." I highlighted the word kindness because she's using that word hesed that we've been talking about so much. She is asking for them to show back hesed unto her as she has shown hesed to them. And for those of you here that weren't here with us last week, hesed is a very important word in the Old Testament. It's basically translated as loving kindness or unfailing love. And really, it's about the love that God shows to his people. It's all based on God's relationship with them, his covenant relationship with them. And in a similar way, Rahab's like, "Hey, I helped you guys out, so please return the favor." And what ends up happening? They conquer Jericho, but they save Rahab and her family. It's just her mother and father, I believe. This is Boaz's mom, right? Boaz is not a normal person. His mom was the one person that betrayed the entire city of Jericho because she believed in God and was accepted and became a Jew, basically. You know, you are allowed to become a Jew even if you weren't ethnically Jew if you started to believe in Judaism. That's the one interesting thing about being Jewish is it's not about ethnicity, it's about your faith. So if you believe in the God of Israel, you can become a Jew. And I think Rahab is probably one of the first foreigners who became a Jew. So think about it. Boaz grew up as ethnically a half-Jew. And his mom was a Wegugin, a foreigner. Right? This is not normal. If I were to put this into today's context, this should be like Boaz growing up as a half-Korean in Korea. Right? Now think about that. Do you think that's easy? Especially, because remember, Rahab was probably one of the first foreigners to ever live with the Jews. So think back when, Korea, 50 years ago, when there were no foreigners here whatsoever, and then there's this one, American woman who marries a Korean here. This actually happened, Billy Kim, Pastor Billy Kim, he married an American woman, and his kids were half Korean. This was 40 years ago. 40, 50 years ago. They're in their 40s now. They grew up in Korea when there were no other foreigners here, but they looked half Korean. Now, we just had VBS here, and kids are cute, but I can also tell you that kids are evil. Right? When they know that there is something strange about you, something different, they will make sure you know that all the time. Right? And automatically, he looked different. Boaz was ethnically half Jewish, so automatically he looked different. I don't know what people from Jericho looked like, but he looked different from everybody else. Now, one interesting thing about half Koreans in particular, they tend to turn out well. There's a higher percentage that tends to turn out well. In all my experience, half Koreans, I don't know what, they tend to get the best of both worlds. But when it doesn't work out, man, it's bad. But the thing is, think about how difficult it would have been for him to, well, here's the other thing. Not only was his mom a foreigner, she's Rahab the prostitute, right? Every kid knows that your mom was a prostitute. Literally, her name Rahab means something like wide streets, which is a terrible meaning. But literally, this is what kids could make fun of all the time. Your mom's a foreigner. Your mom was a prostitute. Think about what kind of trauma this kid must have gone through. But the half, growing up as a half. Now the thing is, I think half Asians or half any ethnicities, they always struggle with what their true identity is, right? And I know some of us can relate to this because we have similar issues not knowing who we are, right? And I think honestly, we make it worse for them because they're not accepted by either race, right? I had a friend, his name was Eric Kim. He's half Caucasian, half Korean. He looked kind of Hispanic. Right? He looked like he was from Mexico or something. And so I always teased him. I was a jerk. I was like, "Hey man," and I would just throw all these racial Hispanic stuff. I don't know why I did this. I thought I was hilarious. And then he told me later, he's like, dude, man, I wasn't cool. And I'm like, I was a jerk in college. And so like that's the thing is, I don't know who he really felt like he belonged to. He didn't really hang out with the Koreans. He tended to hang out with the Chinese guys. I don't know what's going on with that. But like, you know, that's the thing is, people with this type of background struggle with identity. They struggle feeling like they belong. And this is how Boaz grew up. Now, granted, he was given favor, he was a man of standing, but at the same time, just me using my spiritual imagination, he's an older guy with a lot of money, but he's still not married. Now, last week I talked about how when I was looking at Naomi and I was really empathizing with her struggle with just feeling so bitter from all the disappointment and hurt that she had, and how I was starting to relate with her. I started looking at Boaz and I'm like, isn't that me? That older guy who's not married. No one understands why. So I was like, Boaz, I think, had a similar issue where, for whatever reason, even though he was shown favor, he had all these belongings. At the same time, he never felt like he belonged. And so one of the reasons, or the main reason why I think he showed so much favor to Ruth, was he realized when he saw her immediately and he knew her story, she's just like my mom. This is someone that has, in many ways betrayed her own country to follow and to help someone that they believe in. That's exactly what his mother did. And he sees it in Ruth. And at this point in his life, I'm pretty sure Rahab had passed away a long time ago. This is probably the first person that he can relate to in a long time. He finally sees someone who's like his mom and who could actually understand and get him. And to me, what really speaks out to me is, even though on the outside, Boaz seems like this great guy, he has everything, and things are going well for him, I just spiritually imagine, I just sense a lot of loneliness for him. And that in many ways, God providing Ruth, God sending Ruth into his life, was to fill a hole that he didn't even realize he had. And so what I say to that is, God knows the true desires of our heart. Everyone would look at Ruth and say, he's got everything, he's just not married. Like, I don't understand what's wrong with him, but he's got everything. But God knew that there was something else that he longed for. And that was for someone that actually understood him, that understood the struggles that he had gone through, or that he was going to go through. And so what I want to speak from that is, God knows the desires of our heart. It's not just about money. It's not just about all these different things. There are different needs in our lives, whether we realize it or not. And God is very aware of those things. Now, Ruth goes back, she brings back, she hauls that 30 pounds of food, brings it back home, and all of a sudden, Naomi goes from saying 2 words, "Go, daughter," until not being able to shut up. She just keeps talking. Right? All of a sudden, she's like, blah, 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 you got to do this, you got to do this. Like, it's like a complete change in character. And the reason why is because she sees immediately, this is not normal. That blindness that she had in chapter 1 and in the beginning of chapter 2, it's finally been lifted, where she sees immediately, God is answering my prayers. This is the Hesed of God. This is not normal. I didn't even help this woman, and God is providing a way for us to be redeemed. Now, she immediately talks about how Boaz is, she's in the passage, I think it's translated guardian redeemer, which sounds ridiculous. Like, what is a guardian redeemer? Guardians of the Galaxy 2 is coming out soon. But anyway, so she calls him, and the word for this is Goel. She says, he is our Goel. And basically, if you look in the Old Testament, another translation for this is kinsman redeemer. Basically what it is a close relative. And this close relative could do different things for you. If you had to sell your land because you were going through difficulty, they could, in your name, buy your land back for you. Right? This is a very common practice in Israel. The other thing was, if you had to go through difficulty and you had to sell yourself into slavery, they could show up and buy you out of slavery. They were meant to redeem you. And lastly, even if someone killed you, they were actually given free rein to go back and avenge you. right? Like that's the goel. Like people are like, hey, why'd you do that? I'm a goel, okay. like they were given that right to even avenge their death. And so again, just like the gleaning laws, where the agriculture system of the Old Testament was meant to help those in need, even the family system, your relatives were actually given rights and encouraged to help each other in need. That those that had plenty would reach down and help out those that are in need. And it had to be a close relative. But here we find out immediately that Boaz is a goel. He is a redeemer. We will later see in the next chapters how that redemption happens. But we already know that something good is about to happen because they have found someone that can pull them out of the depths in which they're in. And so what we're starting to see is, I told you in chapter 1 that the story is namely about Naomi's redemption. It's not just that. If you're already starting to see that the hesed of God is not just falling on Naomi, it's falling on every single character that's showing up. Even with Boaz. That's the main point I wanted to get to in this chapter, is that even Boaz lacks something. And God is showing his hesed to Boaz. Just as his mother Rahab had asked for the Israelites to show favor, to show kindness unto her, God is continuing that request and passing it on to her son. This story is not just about Naomi's redemption. It's about the redemption of not only these characters, but I'll give you a little sneak hint. It's actually about the redemption of all of Israel. God always takes things that seem very small and he blows it up to another level. And like I said, when I was talking about the book of Esther, Esther is very epic in its scale. Ruth, it's very small in its scale, but the actual impact is just as epic. It impacts the entire nation of Israel. So the main points that I want us to remember is that God desires his people to be generous. So I want to remind you guys, be generous. Be generous with what God has given you. As Boaz says, the Lord be with you. He recognized that the fields that he had, God had given them to him. So in that same way, as God blesses us, be generous. And at the same time, God knows your heart. God knows your needs. And it might not be normal needs from other people, but God knows exactly what you desire and what you need. And at the end of the day, he will redeem. He will redeem any difficulties that you're going through. He will redeem the struggles that you're going through. And it won't just be at your individual level, it will be at a much, much greater scale. So with that, let's take some time to pray before I close for today. I want us to take a moment to just focus on the simple fact that God knows our hearts. And I want you to take a moment to pray and ask God, God, are there things that I've been struggling with, things that I've been lacking, that I don't even realize? That are there things that you need to reveal to me? So I want you to take a moment and just ask God, God, show me the things of my heart. Show me my desires so I can truly understand and I can actually focus my prayers and thoughts and directions to the actual needs of my heart. So let's take a moment to pray and ask God to reveal to us the true desires of our hearts. Let's pray. And as Naomi's character changed completely when she recognized the hesed of God, and she went from someone just filled with bitterness to one filled with hope, I want us to just pray that God could help us to turn our perspectives, to turn our hearts, our minds around,
That we would no longer look toward the negative and the bad things in our lives, but that we would see His hesed, His favor, His blessing in our lives, and that would instead fill us with hope instead of bitterness. So let's really just pray that God would shift our hearts, that we would be people of hope rather than of bitterness. Let's pray. Father, we pray, Lord, that you would fill us with hope, fill us with joy, fill us with peace. And Lord, that you would reveal the things in our lives, Lord, that are actually a reflection of your hesed, your faithfulness to us. Lord, that you've never given up on us. So I pray, Lord, that we would start to see these things more clearly, and that these things, Lord, that we're disappointed in, that these discouragements just fade away as we recognize the truth, Lord, of what you're doing in our lives. Change our hearts and help us to know, Lord, that you know our needs, you know our desires, and that you will truly bring redemption in every area in our lives, Lord. We thank you, Lord. Praise the name of Jesus. Amen.